In 1820, Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson stood before a crowd holding a basket of tomatoes. He ate them all one by one. The crowd, believing the tomatoes to be poisonous, summoned the police as they thought Johnson was committing suicide. However, Johnson survived, and this event, known as the Salem Tomato Trial, changed the perception of tomatoes in America forever. Before the tomato became the juicy red centerpiece of salads and sauces, it was a little berry, living a wild and adventurous life in the tropical forests of South America. Yes, that's right. The tomato, our beloved pizza topping, pasta sauce base, and ketchup star, has an ancient origin story that's more complex and fascinating than you might think. So how did it move from this wild berry plant to the juicy fruit we put on our sandwiches? Today on The World of Food, we look on the epic journey of the tomato. Long before humans were even thinking about farming, somewhere around 80,000 years ago, a wild cherry-sized tomato began its journey in the lush valleys of Ecuador and Peru. And believe it or not, nobody was around to cultivate it yet. This tiny fruit was just doing its own thing. These wild tomatoes, scientifically known as Solanum pimpinellifolium, or pimps for short, were about the size of a pea. Today, they're still hanging out there in the wild, but their domesticated cousins have made it into nearly every kitchen around the world. Fast forward to around 7,000 years ago, humans, always looking for ways to make food tastier, stumbled upon the tomato plant. They didn't immediately recognize its potential, but eventually, native people in South America began experimenting with these tiny, tangy berries. Over time, these early cultivators selected plants that produced slightly bigger fruits. This selective breeding resulted in what we call the intermediate tomato, a fruit about the size of a cherry tomato. But the story doesn't stop there. As humans continued to experiment with tomatoes in the Andes, something interesting happened. The tomato started spreading. No one knows exactly how, but it's likely that birds and animals played a role, munching on the fruit and carrying seeds northward into Central America and Mexico. Maybe some humans even helped out, trading the fruit along with other crops. Now, here's the surprising part. Once these tomatoes spread north into new habitats, they began to change again. Instead of evolving bigger fruits, these tomatoes started to look more like their wild ancestors, smaller, tougher, and with more acidic, tangy flavors. It's like the tomato was hitting the rewind button on its domestication journey. Why would this happen? Well, natural selection in these new environments might have favored plants with more wild-like traits, smaller fruits, higher levels of citric acid, and a tougher skin. Or maybe the people who were growing them didn't care too much about size and sweetness at the time. Eventually, tomatoes found their way into the hands of the Mesoamerican people. Here, farmers continued to cultivate the plant, slowly selecting for larger fruits. By the time the tomato reached the Mesoamerican civilizations, it was no longer a pea-sized wild berry. It was a proper cherry-sized fruit, the next step toward the tomatoes we know today. Now comes a pivotal moment in the tomato's history, the Age of Exploration. In the 1500s, European explorers arrived in the Americas, and along with them came the tomato's chance to become a global superstar. The Spanish were particularly intrigued by this new fruit, and they wasted no time bringing it back to Europe. But the tomato didn't immediately win over everyone. In fact, Europeans were pretty suspicious of it at first. Being a member of the nightshade family, a group of plants that includes some pretty toxic relatives, like belladonna, people thought tomatoes might be poisonous. They were cautious, to say the least. For decades, tomatoes were grown as ornamental plants in European gardens. People admired their bright red color, but were too nervous to eat them. Who could blame them? Eventually, though, the brave souls in Italy took the plunge. Italian cooks started experimenting with tomatoes. And it wasn't long before they realized this fruit was not only safe to eat, but incredibly delicious. By the 18th century, tomatoes had firmly planted their roots in Mediterranean cuisine. Italians weren't the only ones to embrace the tomato, but they certainly did it with gusto. The tomato became a key ingredient in iconic dishes like pasta sauces, pizzas, and caprese salads. And from there, the love for tomatoes spread across Europe. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, tomatoes were making their way into North American kitchens. By the 1700s, tomatoes were growing in colonial gardens, although they weren't an instant hit. In the US, much like in Europe, people were wary of eating tomatoes at first. Whether or not that story is true, it illustrates just how much fear surrounded this humble fruit. Fast forward to today, and tomatoes are everywhere. From sauces and salads to juices and ketchup. It's hard to imagine a world without them. Modern tomatoes come in all shapes and sizes. Cherry tomatoes, beefsteaks, romas, you name it. There's a tomato variety for every dish. But even after all these centuries of domestication, scientists are still learning more about tomatoes. In fact, recent research has revealed that the modern cultivated tomato is more closely related to wild tomatoes still found in Mexico today. These wild-like tomatoes have traits that could be incredibly useful for modern agriculture and medicine. Some varieties have traits that promote disease resistance and drought tolerance, making them valuable for breeding hardier crops. From its humble origins as a tiny wild fruit in South America to becoming a global culinary staple, the tomato has come a long way. Today, it's hard to imagine our kitchens, restaurants, or grocery stores without it. But the next time you slice into a juicy tomato, remember, you're eating the result of thousands of years of evolution, experimentation, and a little bit of human ingenuity. Thanks for watching.